Hello, Psychology 150 students. Before I get started, I wanted to let you know you might hear a little bit of noise in the background. That's actually some ferrets and some cats going at it with each other, so I apologize for the background noise. Hopefully it won't disturb us too much. But what we're doing today is we're going to be covering Chapter 9 regarding intelligence. So this is the first lecture that we're going to have online while we're off-site. We're not at campus. So section 9.1, we're going to be covering intelligence and intelligence tests. So after we study this module, we should be able to describe the factor G, the evidence for it, and the explanations for it. We'll look at the differences between fluid and crystallized intelligence. We'll look at 3 common IQ tests and describe and evaluate the evidence for hereditary and environmental influences on intellectual development. Again, thank you for your patience with the background noise. So as we'll discover in this chapter, it's not easy to define intelligence. Here are some attempts to do so, such as saying the mental abilities that enable one to adapt, to shape, or select one's environment, the ability to deal with novel situations, the ability to judge, comprehend, and reason, the ability to understand and deal with people, objects, and symbols, the ability to act purposefully, think rationally, and deal effectively with the environment. Well, unfortunately, none of these definitions is fully satisfactory. What would be nice if it happened would be to say that psychologists first analyze learning, memory, and cognition, and then built upon that knowledge to understand intelligence. In fact, psychological researchers began with tests of intellectual abilities, defined as the ability to do well in school. Then they conducted research to find out what the test actually measured. It may strike you as odd to measure something before being sure what it is. However, to learn what something is, one needs research, and any good research starts with measurement. I'm finding it a little humorous. I'm hearing a lot of ferret noise in the background. Again, I apologize for that. Any rate, we're going to be looking at the G factor now. Charles Spearman measured how well many people perform tasks such as how they follow directions, how they judged musical pitch, how they matched colors, and how they did math. He found that performance on any of his tasks correlated positively with performance on any of the others. So Spearman therefore inferred that all the tasks have something in common. To perform well on any test of mental ability, Spearman argued, people need a general ability, which he called G, for general. So to account for the fact that performances on various tasks do not correlate perfectly, Spearman suggested that each task also requires a specific ability, or S. So that's where you see G in the center of this figure, and then you see the S's on the sides. Those are specific abilities. Thus, intelligence consists of general abilities plus an unknown number of specific abilities, such as mechanical, musical, which is not shown here, arithmetical, logical, and spatial abilities. So there are 2 explanations as to why people who perform well on one type of test generally perform well on other tests as well. In addition, many psychologists believe that the G factor corresponds to an ability that underlies all kinds of intelligence, such as mental speed or working memory. Perhaps people who perform well on a variety of intellectual tests do so because all the tests depend on one underlying skill. One possibility is working memory. Another possibility is speed of processing information. Another possibility is that different abilities correlate with one another because the same growth factors that promote any one of them also support the others. An alternate explanation for G is that several types of intelligence correlate because they grow in the same ways. By analogy, consider the lengths of 3 body parts: the left arm, the left leg, the right arm, and the left index finger. As a rule, most people who have a long left leg also have a long right arm and a long left index finger, because the factors that increase the growth of one also help the others grow. Factors such as genes, health, and nutrition. Similarly, all forms of intelligence depend on genes, health, education, and nutrition. So most people who have good support for developing one intellectual skill also have support for developing other skills. Then there are hierarchical models of intelligence. There's fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the power of reasoning, using information, and solving new problems with the emphasis on new. Crystallized intelligence are acquired skills and knowledge that you already possess, and then the ability to apply that knowledge that you already possess in specific situations. So fluid intelligence enables you to learn new skills on the job, and crystallized intelligence includes the job skills you have already acquired. The ability to learn new words is an example of fluid intelligence, and the words already learned are part of your crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence reaches its peak about age 20, remains nearly steady for decades, and declines on average in old age. However, crystallized intelligence remains steady or even increases over age. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Howard Gardner argued that people have many independent types of intelligence, including social attentiveness, musical abilities, and motor skills. However, so far, no one has demonstrated that different types of intelligence are independent of one another. IQ tests, or intelligent quotient tests. Aptitude is the ability to learn, which we now know is fluid intelligence, and then we have achievement, which is something we've already learned, which we know now to be crystallized intelligence. In terms of those two types of intelligence, if you were in charge of choosing which applicants a college should admit, you would want to select those who would be the best students. Because students will study subjects they've not studied before, it makes sense to measure a range of academic skills, not knowledge of a single topic. That is, you want a test of aptitude, that's the ability to learn, or fluid intelligence, in addition to achievement, what someone has already learned, or crystallized intelligence. The original goal of intelligence tests was to identify the least capable children who could not learn from ordinary schooling. Before long, tests were also used to identify the best students who would profit from accelerated classes. Similar tests are used for selecting among applicants to colleges and professional schools. Then we have intelligent quotient tests. These were procedures that tried to predict someone's performance in school and similar settings. The term quotient originated when IQ was determined by dividing mental age by chronological age and then multiplying by 100. So mental age is the average age of children who perform as well as this child. Chronological age is the same age as birth. For example, if you have an 8-year-old who performs like an average 10-year-old, they're 8 years old, who performs like an average 10-year-old, has a mental age of 10, a chronological age of 8, and an IQ of 10 divided by 8 times 100, which equals 125. That method is now obsolete, but the term remains. Alfred Binet and Theophile Simon devised the first IQ tests, and the Stanford, Binet, and Wessler tests are the most widely used IQ tests. The Stanford Binet tests. The Stanford and Binet were two French psychologists. They developed a procedure and they later modified it for English speakers by Stanford psychologists. So the test that Binet and Simon designed was later modified for English speakers by Stanford psychologists and published as the Stanford-Binet IQ test. The test items are designated by age. An item designated as age 8, for example, age 8, will be answered correctly by 60 to 90% of 8-year-olds. A child who answers correctly most of the age 8 items, but not the age 9 items, has a mental age of 8. This is the first page of Table 9.1. There's also a second page that gives examples of the types of items on the Stanford-Binet test. It starts with age 2, where it looks at a test administrator pointing at pictures of everyday objects and asking, what is this, etc. Then it goes on to age 4, asking questions such as, why do people live in houses? Age 6, here's a picture of a horse. What do you see, or do you see what part of the horse is missing? And age 8, here's a picture, age 8, what should you do if you find a lost puppy? Stephanie can't write today because she twisted her ankle. What is wrong with her? So those are various types of questions that could be asked between ages 2 through 8. Going on with the Stanford-Binet test gives further examples of the types of items that could be asked as the subject matures. At age 10, questions such as, why should people be quiet in a library? Repeat after me, 483714. Age 12, what does regret mean? Or here's a picture, can you tell me what's wrong with it? Age 14, what is the similarity between high and low? Etc. And then as an adult, make up a sentence using the words celebrate, reverse, and appointment. And then they have in here, which I thought was interesting, what do people mean when they say people who live in glass houses should not throw stones? For those of us not familiar with that phrase, what that means is one who is unable to, or one who is vulnerable to criticism regarding a certain issue should not criticize others about the same issue. To continue on with the Stanford-Binet test, we have the concept of what's known as adaptive testing. This is a method where the range of items used is adapted to the performance of the individual. School psychologists are carefully trained on how to administer the test and score the items. A psychologist testing an 8-year-old might start with the items designated for a 7-year-old. Unless a child misses many of the 7-year-old items, the psychologist gives credit for all the 6-year-old items without testing them. If the child answers most of the 7-year-old items correctly, the psychologist proceeds to the items for the 8-year-olds, the 9-year-olds, and so forth, until the child begins to miss most items. At that point, the psychologist ends the test. This method is known as adaptive testing because the range of items is adapted to the performance of the individual. Stanford-Binet IQ scores are computed from tables set up to ensure that a given IQ score means the same for different ages. The mean IQ at each age is 100. A 6-year-old with an IQ score of, say, 116 has performed better on the test than 84% of other 6-year-olds. The Stanford-Binet provides subscores reflecting visual reasoning, short-term memory, and other specialized skills. It also provides an overall IQ score, a verbal IQ score, and a nonverbal IQ score based on items answered by handling items instead of by speech. The Wessler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition, thought I'd start checking these off for us. The WAIS-4 is a test originally devised by David Wessler and later modified by others. The Wessler Intelligence Scale for Children, 5th edition, or the WISC-5, is a test originally devised by David Wessler, commonly used with children. And the WISC is for children up to age 16, and the WAIS is for everyone older. As you can see here, I'm left-handed, and so I'm using left-handed check, so bear with me. A Wechsler test provides an overall IQ, verbal IQ, a performance IQ based on the tasks that do not require verbal response, and a subtest score representing working memory, verbal comprehension, processing speed, and other factors. Each part of the WISC-4 or the WAIS-4 starts with simple questions and progresses to more difficult ones. The subscores call attention to someone's strengths and weaknesses. And educators use the Wechsler test to identify possible learning disabilities. Next, we're going to look at culture-reduced testing. There's something known as progressive matrices, the most widely used culture-reduced testing. The matrices, which progress gradually from easy to difficult items, attempt to measure abstract reasoning, that fluid intelligence, that which we continue to learn, without any use of language or reference to factual information. The advantage is the test is fairer for someone who's not a native speaker of English. The disadvantage is that it provides only a single score instead of identifying someone's strengths and weaknesses. Okay, what I'm going to try to do here, first of all, we see this mean correlation for the IQs of children with various degrees of genetic and environmental similarity. But in this table, you can't see the correlation of IQ scores for monozygotic twins reared together. 0.8, I'm going to try very carefully to do this. Forgive my handwriting. This is 0.8 0.85. Thank you. The dizygotic twins raised together is 0.6. So I hope you are fine with that. If you would like to see it actually in the table, it's on page 295. So, Table 9.2 shows the correlation of IQ scores for people with various degrees of genetic relationship. The scores of monozygotic or identical twins correlate with each other about 0.85. Got to get that here. Excuse me, it was going to be 0.85 here. Significantly higher than dizygotic twins, which is 0.6, like fraternal twins, so to speak, but not exactly, or non-twin siblings. Non-twin siblings is 0.47. So monozygotic twins also closely resemble each other in brain volume and in specific skills such as working memory, attention, reading, and mathematics. Greater the similarity between monozygotic than dizygotic twins implies that it's a genetic basis. In Table 9.2, note that the high correlation between monozygotic twins reared apart, which is right here, 0.78, that is, it still strongly resembles the other monozygotic twins that are reared together. 0.85 is pretty close, 0.78 and 0.85. So that strongly resemble each other on IQ tests, even if they're adopted by separate sets of parents. Monozygotic twins continue to resemble each other throughout life, even beyond age 80. In fact, monozygotic twins become more and more similar to each other in IQ as they grow older, indicating that the influence of genes is greater in older than in younger individuals. Dizygotic twins, 0.6, resemble each other more closely than single birth siblings do. So even though they're not identical twins, this finding suggests an influence from being born at the same time and therefore sharing more of the same environment. So in Table 9.2, note the correlation between unrelated children adopted into the same family, which is 0.31. However, this correlation is lower than the correlation between biological brothers and sisters, 0.47. The IQs of young adopted children correlate moderately with those of adoptive parents. However, as the children grow older, their IQ scores gradually correlate more with those of their biological parents and less with those of their adoptive parents. Okay, in terms of gene identification, dozens of genetic variations have been reported to correlate with measures of intelligence, but no common variant has a large effect. Intelligence depends on many genes making small contributions and depends on epigenetic influences as well. And we did look at epigenetic influences earlier, and epigenetics is the study of organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than alteration of the genetic code itself. The Human Genome Project and related research now make it possible to identify particular genes that promote intelligence. The strategy is to locate genes that are more common among those with higher IQ scores than those with lower scores, or the reverse. Dozens of genetic variations have been reported to correlate with measures of intelligence, but no common variant has a large effect. Now we're going to look at environmental influences and interventions. Intellectual development depends on many aspects of the environment, including physical health in early childhood. When we think about environmental influences on intelligence, we might think first about how often parents read to their children, take them to museums, and so forth. Those factors can certainly be important, but other environmental influences deserve attention. In particular, much research emphasizes the role of physical health early in life. Mean IQ is consistently lower in the countries and states where children have the highest exposure to infectious diseases such as tetanus, malaria, tuberculosis, hepatitis, cholera, and measles. And with the coronavirus, we could see that it would probably have effects as well. Extensive interventions can help children's intellectual development if started early in life and continued for years. A variety of programs have provided special interventions for children from extremely deprived homes to foster their intellectual development. Randomized control studies demonstrate long-term benefits from educational programs, as well as from dietary supplements. Although no brief educational program helps much, intensive programs occupying many hours per week for several years produce significant lasting benefits. Now we're going to look at evaluation of intelligence tests. We're going to define what standardization of intelligence test is, explain what the Flynn effect is and the evidence for it, describe the evidence that researchers use to measure reliability and validity, define test bias, and describe the evidence that researchers use to measure it, and discuss stereotype threat, which was the video that we are going to be covering for this week that I should be sending to you. All right, to evaluate IQ tests, we need to rely on objective evidence. The evaluation begins with standardization. Standardization is the process of evaluating the questions, establishing rules for administering the test, and interpreting the scores. One step in this process is to find the norms, descriptions of how frequently various scores occur. Psychologists try to standardize a test on a large sample of people who are as representative as possible of the population. And now we're going to talk about the distribution of IQ scores. So to determine the meaning of test scores, the authors of a test determine the mean and the distribution of scores for a random or representative sample of the population. And if you can recall, a random sample is a sample in which every individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected. Whereas in a representative sample, it's a sample that resembles the population in certain selected regards, like women, men, by race, or other various factors. Binet, Wechsler, and the others who devised IQ tests chose items arranging the scoring method to establish a mean of 100. The standard deviation measures variance among individuals. So the standard deviation is a quantity that's calculated to indicate the extent of the deviation for a group as a whole. So the standard deviation is 15 for the Wechsler test, and it's 16 for the Stanford-Binet. The standard deviation is small if most scores are close to the mean and large if scores vary widely. The scores for a large population approximate a normal distribution or a bell-shaped curve, which would look something like this. A bell-shaped curve would be straight on the top and down, and here would be somewhat like a bell-shaped curve. Not exactly, but that's about what it would look like. The actual distribution of IQ scores is not as symmetrical as the theoretical normal distribution. The mode, which is the score that occurs most often, the most frequent score, is higher than 100, and a bulge of lower scores do exist. So the mode, the most common score, is about 105 instead of 100. And more people score above 100 than below 100, but a slight bulge in the 60 to 85 range lowers the mean score to about 100. The bulge at the lower end represents people with disabilities. The term mentally challenged or mentally disabled refers to people more than 2 standard deviations below the test average, corresponding to an IQ score of 68 or 70. Depending on the test, 68 here, 70 here. An IQ score of 130 or more is in the gifted range. Since the first IQ test, psychologists have found that girls tend to do better than boys on certain kinds of language tasks, such as verbal fluency, whereas boys tend to do better than girls on visuospatial rotations, which they denote the visual perception of the spatial relationships of objects. On the waist, test, men generally have higher scores on certain subtests, whereas women have higher scores on others. On attention tasks, males more often focus on one item at a time, whereas females spread their attention more broadly. However, none of these differences are huge. And now we're going to discuss the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is the tendency for performance on IQ tests to improve from one generation to the next. A typical figure is about 3 IQ points per 10 years. So to keep the mean score at 100, authors of IQ tests have had to revise the test periodically. Also, this does make them always making them more difficult. That is, raw performance has been increasing steadily. The tendency is known as the Flynn effect again. The results vary across countries, tests, and periods of time. But a typical figure is about 3 IQ points per 10 years. 3 IQ points per 10 years. If you took the same IQ test that your parents took at your age, you'd probably would score higher than they did. If you took an IQ test from your grandparents' era, your score would still be higher. So even though the reasons for these trends are unknown, there are some hypotheses. Some of those are that there is improved education and test-taking skills, that there's an increased tendency for people to marry outside their own neighborhood, there's decreases in mental retardation, there's increased cognitive stimulation, there's improved health, improved nutrition, and even more childhood exposure to artificial lights can help improve IQ scores potentially. And now we're going to talk about reliability and validity as they relate to test scores. So when psychologists want to evaluate the accuracy or fairness of a test, they examine specific kinds of evidence related to its reliability and its validity. So reliability is the repeatability of a test scores. If a test is reliable, it produces nearly the same results every time. To determine the reliability of a test, psychologists calculate a correlation coefficient, and this can be done by test-retest reliability, which is the correlation between scores on a first test and a retest, or a division of a test, as I will explain. A correlation coefficient measures how accurately we can use one measurement to predict another. Psychologists may test the same people twice with the same test, or with equal versions of the test, like test A and test B, and then compare the two sets of scores. Or they may compare the scores on the first and second halves of a test, or they may compare the scores of the test's odd number of items and the even numbered items. If all items measure approximately the same thing, one set of scores could correlate highly with the other. So IQ scores are reasonably stable over time for most individuals. So validity is the second component of the tests. It's the degree to which the evidence and theory support the interpretations of test scores for the intended purposes. Another way to think of validity is, does the test measure what it is supposed to measure? So to determine the validity of a test, researchers examine 5 types of evidence. They look at the content of the test itself. They look at response processes people use while taking the test. They look at the internal structure of the test. They look at the score's relation to other variables. And they look at the consequences of testing while using the test. There can be special problems given all of this, however, in measuring validity. So measuring the validity of a test can still be difficult. When tests are not perfectly reliable, the scores are going to fluctuate. The lower the reliability, the greater the fluctuation. IQ tests for infants have low reliability. The scores fluctuate widely, even from one day to the next. If someone selects infants with low scores and retests them later, their mean IQ score is almost certain to improve simply because the scores had nowhere to go but up. So are IQ tests biased? Well, if they are biased, it's the tendency for test scores to overstate or understate the true performance of one or more groups. So in addition to being reliable and valid, the test should also be unbiased so it's equally fair and accurate for all groups. Psychologists try to remove from a test any item that tends to be easy for one group to answer but difficult for another group. They also try to evaluate whether the test as a whole makes equally accurate predictions for all groups. So to determine whether a test is biased against groups, psychologists conduct several kinds of research. They try to identify bias both in individual test items and in the test as a whole. So stereotype threat, people's perceived risk of performing poorly and thereby supporting an unfavorable stereotype about a group, which you're going to watch in the video. So ways to combat stereotype threat, one way is to simply tell people about the stereotype threat before the test and urge them not to let the stereotype bother them. The example they gave in the video about whistling Vivaldi, the title of the video, was the women that were asked to take a math test. And typically the women, even though they were intellectually as astute in taking the math test as the men, tended not to do as well. So before the math test, the women met with the test takers or test instructors, and basically, or test administrators, that would be. And the test administrators informed them that typically there is a stereotype about women not doing as well on math tests, that's not true. Do not let the stereotype bother them. And after that, they performed as well as the men did. Another way to overcome the stereotype threat is through writing interventions. And the writing interventions is another approach for students who lack confidence about their test performance to write about their most important values, their most valuable characteristics, and how it feels to be highly successful, and their concerns and their worries. And just documenting those before the test helps them to do better on the test itself.